The train that vanished beneath the snow. The Wellington Avalanche of 1910. Imagine being trapped on a train in the middle of a snowstorm. Outside, the mountains are disappearing beneath snow. The tracks ahead are buried. The tracks behind are buried too. And every few hours, another avalanche crashes down somewhere in the darkness. You have no way to escape, no way to call for help. All you can do is wait. Then, after days trapped in the mountains, the snow suddenly stops. For a brief moment, it feels like the nightmare might finally be over. But outside, something even more dangerous is happening. The temperature is rising. The snow is becoming heavier. Rain begins to fall. And high above the train, thousands of tons of snow are waiting on the mountainside. At 1:42 in the morning, while most of the passengers are asleep, the mountain comes down. Within seconds, 2 entire trains disappear. 96 people will never make it home. This is the true story of the Wellington Avalanche, one of the deadliest disasters in American railroad history, and the deadliest avalanche disaster in United States history. The story began in February of 1910. The Great Northern Railway connected the Pacific Northwest with the rest of the United States. Its trains crossed the Cascade Mountains, carrying passengers, mail, workers, and supplies through one of the most dangerous mountain routes in America. Winter was always difficult here, but in February 1910, the mountains were experiencing something far worse than an ordinary winter. Storm after storm buried the Cascade Mountains beneath enormous amounts of snow. Railroad workers fought constantly to keep the tracks open. Snow plows pushed forward. Men with shovels worked for hours. But every time they cleared one section of track, more snow seemed to take its place. And then the avalanches began. 2 westbound Great Northern trains were caught in the chaos. One was a passenger train. The other carried mail and railroad workers. Both were trying to make their way toward Seattle, but the mountains had other plans. The trains became trapped near a small railroad settlement called Wellington, high in the Cascade Mountains of Washington. And there they remained, day after day. The passengers waited. At first, many probably believed the delay was simply an inconvenience, an annoying interruption to their journey. But as the days passed, the situation became more serious. The trains could not move forward. They could not return. Snow and avalanches had blocked the route. Outside, railroad workers continued their desperate battle against the weather. Inside the trains, passengers waited. They ate. They slept. They talked. And they listened. Because outside, the mountains were making terrifying sounds. The roar of distant avalanches, the crash of snow and trees, the constant wind. Imagine lying in your sleeping compartment at night and hearing the sound of an avalanche somewhere in the darkness. Then wondering, was it far away? Or was the next one coming for you? The trains remained trapped for nearly a week. And still, the railroad workers continued trying to clear the route. But the mountains were becoming increasingly unstable. Then, the weather changed. The heavy snowfall began to give way to warmer temperatures. Rain fell onto the deep layers of snow. And on the steep slopes above Wellington, the enormous accumulation became dangerously unstable. The passengers had survived the blizzard. But the blizzard was not going to be what killed them. On the night of February 28th, the weather was violent. Rain and wind moved through the mountains. A thunderstorm was reported in the area. And while the people inside the trains tried to sleep, The mountain above them was reaching its breaking point. It was early in the morning of March 1st, 1910. Most of Wellington was asleep. Inside the passenger cars, people were sleeping too. Some had been trapped in the mountains for days. They were exhausted. They had no idea that, high above them, an enormous mass of snow was beginning to move. Then it happened. A massive avalanche broke loose from the mountainside. It came down with unbelievable force. Snow, ice, trees, rocks, earth, everything in its path was swept forward. The avalanche raced toward Wellington. There was almost no time to react. No warning. No chance for passengers to wake up and escape. The enormous mass struck the railroad tracks, and then it hit the trains. The force was catastrophic. Entire cars were ripped from the tracks. Locomotives and railroad cars were thrown down the mountainside. The trains were carried approximately 150 feet into the Ty River Valley below. In seconds, the peaceful train cars where people had been sleeping became a tangled mass of wreckage, snow, trees, and debris. For some passengers, the disaster was over almost instantly. For others, the nightmare had just begun. In the darkness, survivors found themselves trapped. Some were buried beneath snow. Others were injured inside crushed train cars. There were people who could hear voices calling for help, but reaching them was incredibly difficult. The avalanche had destroyed the trains. The storm had isolated the area, and there was always the terrifying possibility that another avalanche could come down. Still, rescuers began searching. Railroad workers and people from the nearby settlement rushed toward the wreckage. They searched through the snow and debris, and in some cases, they found survivors. People were pulled from the wreckage alive. Incredibly, 23 people survived. But the rescue operation was slow and dangerous. The disaster had happened high in the mountains. The weather remained a serious threat, and the wreckage was buried beneath an enormous mass of snow and debris. Rescuers could not simply arrive with modern equipment. This was 1910. There were no helicopters, no advanced communication systems, no modern avalanche rescue teams. People had to fight their way through the mountains. They had to dig, search, listen, and hope. As the days passed, the true scale of the disaster became clear. 96 people had died. Passengers, railroad employees, workers, people who had simply boarded a train expecting to reach their destination, but instead, they had found themselves trapped inside one of the worst natural disasters in American history. Some bodies remained buried for months. The mountains had not only destroyed the trains, they had hidden the evidence of the disaster beneath snow and debris. The final victim was not recovered until the summer of 1910. For Wellington, nothing would ever be the same again. The disaster exposed just how dangerous the mountain route had become. Avalanches had always been a threat in the Cascades, but now everyone understood the terrible cost of that danger. The Great Northern Railway took steps to improve protection along the route. More snow sheds were constructed to protect trains from avalanches. Eventually, a new and longer Cascade Tunnel provided a safer route through the mountains, and the name Wellington itself slowly disappeared from the railroad maps. The settlement was renamed Ty. Perhaps the name Wellington had become too closely connected to tragedy. But the mountain never forgot. And neither did the families of the people who died there. Today, the remains of the old railroad route still tell the story. A story of men fighting snow with shovels, of passengers waiting inside trapped trains, of families expecting their loved ones to arrive home, and of one night when an entire mountainside suddenly came alive. The people aboard those trains survived days of blizzards. They survived isolation. They survived being trapped in one of the harshest environments in America. And after all of that, many probably believed the worst was behind them. They were wrong. Sometimes in history, the most terrifying moment comes after you think you are safe. On March 1st, 1910, the passengers aboard 2 trains near Wellington, Washington, went to sleep believing they were waiting for the storm to end. Instead, the mountain came down. And by morning, 2 trains had vanished beneath the snow. This was the Wellington Avalanche, a disaster that killed 96 people. And a reminder that even with all the power of machines, railroads, and human determination, nature can change everything in a matter of seconds. And somewhere beneath the mountains of Washington, the story of those trains still remains, waiting beneath the snow.